Uncle Frank, out on Amazon Prime now, new film starring Paul Bettany, Sophia Lillis, and Peter Macdissi. Interesting thing for me personally is that just one day before I saw Uncle Frank, I watched Happiest Season, which is the new lesbian Christmas rom-com, and I was very disappointed by it. And then I went into this film blindly, not knowing what it's about. And very soon it turned out that the overall premise is actually quite similar in a lot of ways. So I thought to myself, okay, here we go again. But as it turns out, my experience this time around was infinitely better as I completely loved Uncle Frank, and for me it was one of the best emotional roller coasters of the entire year. The story takes place in the early 1970s. At the beginning, we meet Beth, played by Sophia Lillis. She's a teenager living in a small town, South Carolina. Through her eyes, we also meet her family, basically what you would expect from a typical southern US family like that. But then there's also Uncle Frank, played by Paul Bettany, who only comes back to town once in a long while and normally lives in New York City. We can immediately see he's different from the rest. He's more of an intellectual, a bit of an outcast. When all these people are shouting and drinking beers and watching football games on TV, he's off on the porch reading books. And he's actually working at a university. He doesn't quite fit with the rest of the family. And there's also very clearly some underlying tension between him and his father for reasons at the time unknown. On the other hand, Beth adores Frank and they have a really sweet connection. They really like one another. Then we skip forward 4 years. Beth is now studying university, in fact, the same school that Frank is teaching at. She's discovering this whole new world which comes with moving to New York, and one of the things she discovers accidentally is the reason for Frank's disconnect from his dad. He's actually gay. Living with his longtime Arabic boyfriend Wally, played by the wonderful Peter Macdissi. And immediately after this revelation, Frank gets a phone call. His father actually died and he has to go back to the funeral. The three characters end up embarking on what is essentially a road trip to South Carolina. And on the way, there's going to be a lot of bonding, a lot of fun and witty conversations, and for Frank, a lot of revisiting of his past, which, as it turns out, holds more secrets and sorrow and pain than it may have initially seemed. So this film was absolutely brilliant, and to explain the primary reason, I'll go back to the earlier comparison with Happiest Season. That movie didn't work for me primarily because of poorly written characters, and this is precisely the aspect that Uncle Frank gets right. The main trio is just fantastic, and that goes for every aspect of the character. The writing, the casting, and the performances. They're just such amazing people. When it's just the three of them on screen, the film has this relaxed summer afternoon atmosphere. I think I would honestly watch a 3-hour movie of them just driving around and talking about random stuff. It's a pleasant company to spend time with. It's also a fantastic balancing act from purely the writing perspective in terms of how the characters fulfill different roles in the story. Beth is the audience insert. She serves as the eyes of the audience, discovering the world with us. Frank is the centerpiece of the plot, the reason that the story happens in the first place, and his decisions and experiences are the main motor pushing it forward. And finally, we have Wally, who serves as the emotional anchor, the heart of the film, as it were. And I will repeat, Peter Macdissi is absolutely wonderful. He oozes charm in every scene he's in, and it's just impossible not to love his character. Such a sweet, sweet guy. And then around these three characters, we have the story itself, which I think is also quite great, even if it's maybe not the most original or fresh tale. I think that the story beats may be a little bit predictable, and there's probably nothing that we haven't seen already elsewhere. But because the execution works so well, that's fine for me. The movie engaged me on an emotional level. I smiled, I laughed, I had my heart broken at one point and shed some manly tears, and then it was put together again by the ending. I also loved the one tiny thing that the movie does, which was there were these two scenes where the movie builds up tension and it feels like there's danger incoming, external danger, that because of the context, because the characters are gay in a southern small town America, bad things will now happen to them. And in both scenes, the movie deliberately builds those expectations only to wave them away, and actually everything is fine. I thought that was great because on the one hand, it fit greatly with the movie's overall warm atmosphere. It didn't disrupt it in this way. And on the other hand, because instead of introducing these external sources of drama, it kept relying on the character dynamics, which again are its strongest part. There are a few things that I think were imperfect. I think that there were some weird editing choices with cutting away from one scene to another. I think there are a few jokes which, I, let's say, pretended to be smarter than they actually were. There's some voiceover narration at the start and end of the film, which, on the one hand, it serves as bookending the film, but I think the movie could do without it. Just, show not tell. And finally, the ending itself. I think you can make a case that it's a bit too elegant, a bit too optimistic, and maybe even a little cheap. But I will say this, it works anyway because I've bonded with the characters so much that anything else would just do them a disservice. I felt they deserved this moment of happiness, and the ending provided this cathartic feeling after a roller coaster of emotions in the third act. And so while I recognize some flaws in the film, I don't much care about them because of how engaged emotionally I was. The film worked perfectly for me on that level. I fell in love with the characters, I enjoyed the atmosphere of the film. I think it was just splendid.